Well, after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, so-called, ICE is now the most well-funded federal law enforcement agency in the country's history. Now the question is, why? I mean, we can all think of a couple of reasons, can't we? But I assure you, the rabbit hole goes even deeper. From Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. Let's crack open a history book. So it goes without saying that this is a hot button issue right now, so it is probably more important than usual to get some historical context before we keep going. We'll start really quickly with ICE and then go to immigration enforcement. But I think a fun fact here is that ICE is among the country's newest federal agencies. It can trace its history all the way back to 2002 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11. Before then, Customs was Treasury's problem, and immigration enforcement was up to two other agencies, Immigration and Naturalization Services, or INS, and Border Patrol. And well before that, it was actually a state issue, but we're going to get there in a second. Because, and there is really no other way to say this, U.S. immigration enforcement from the start has been a function of racial discrimination. I'm not saying that to be inflammatory, that is literally a function of the very first U.S. naturalization law ever passed by Congress in 1790. Under a very plain reading of that law, you could only become a U.S. citizen if you had immigrated here, lived in the U.S. for 2 years, and were a free white person. Kinda just says it right there. In point of fact, African Americans were not offered naturalization until after the Civil War ended in 1865, Union won by the way, and it wasn't until 1952, that Congress offered naturalization for Asians immigrating to the United States, though that one, they still put quotas on the total number of Asian immigrants, so you do not gotta hand it to them. If you want to look at deportation specifically, Congress passes the first real deportation laws as part of the Alien Friends and Alien Enemies Act in 1798. These are the old intolerable acts, and people did not like them, except for the Alien Enemies Act, which is the only one that stuck around. By 1803, though, the United States starts seeing its first ever immigration bans. These are related to the Haitian Revolution, the old French island or half an island of Saint-Domingue. After a revolution led by slaves and former slaves on the island, thousands of Haitian refugees fleeing the violent war came to the United States. Fearing similar slave revolts, many southern states completely banned foreign slave imports. They also severely restricted anyone coming from the new Haiti, and in fact, Haiti wasn't recognized by the US government until 1862. By the 1830s, multiple southern states had passed what were called Negro Seaman Acts. These laws operated under the paranoia that any free black sailor could come into the South and spread ideas about freedom as a kind of social contagion. Under that pretense, southern cities jailed those free black seamen and then demanded exorbitant ransoms from their ship captains in order for their freedom. If they didn't pay, then those sailors were sold into slavery. By the 1840s, some contemporary estimates showed that hundreds of black sailors were being arrested in southern ports every single year. But at this point, immigration is still essentially a state-by-state issue, and it's not until the 1880s that a series of Supreme Court cases put immigration squarely under the control of the federal government. From that point on, Congress passes a series of laws restricting immigration from explicitly non-white countries, especially Asian countries. You may have heard of such pieces of legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act or something like Teddy Roosevelt's Gentleman's Agreement, all designed to limit Asian immigration to the United States. After World War II, however, immigration enforcement starts to focus very specifically on immigrants from Latin America, and in particular, immigrants from Mexico. See, in 1942, the United States institutes something called the Bracero Program. Created under FDR and in the middle of World War II, the idea was that the United States could give an incentive to Mexican farm laborers to come and work in the United States for up to 6 months, while American GIs were fighting World War II. Separately, it also helped paper over some diplomatic bad blood between the US and Mexico after the United States had repatriated hundreds of thousands of Mexicans during the Great Depression. Under the Bracero program, something like 4 million Mexicans came to work in the United States under these temporary labor agreements. But the program increasingly drew critics the longer it existed into the 1950s and early 1960s. And the criticism came from lots of places. On the one hand, you had people who just didn't like illegal immigrants and said that the Bracero program incentivized illegal immigration. On the other, there were nativist labor concerns that Mexican workers were crowding out American workers on these farms, but there were also other general labor concerns, especially that illegal illegal immigrants had no legal protections and were being forced to live in squalid conditions without the other labor protections that the Bracero program would have otherwise provided. And indeed, as the program went on, many American farms preferred hiring illegal immigrants because they simply didn't have to abide by any of those legal restrictions. Now, stop me if this sounds familiar, but by the 1950s, debates over the Bracero program devolved into debates over whether there were simply too many Mexicans crossing the southern border. Here, I think it's useful to read directly from an article from the New York Times published in January 1954. In war, the dawn of a new day may mean a new attack, or it may bring temporary, uneasy inactivity. But down here on the Mexican border, the dawn of each new day, 7 days a week, brings the renewal of an unremitting, if bloodless battle to stem a never-ending invasion of the United States. Truly, time is a flat circle. So I'm going to use the slur that the government used here because words are important, and I think when the government decides to use a slur for its major deportation program, it's notable. That's because in 1954 and 1955, the Eisenhower administration embarks on one of the largest propaganda campaigns this young country had ever seen in Operation Wetback. For months, Border Patrol agents swept through parts of California, Texas, Chicago, and even the Mississippi Delta, and they made sure to call reporters so they knew where to be. At the end of the first day, U.S. Border Patrol arrested nearly 5,000 men. By the end of the first month, they claimed to have arrested over 42,000 and scared another 46,000 into self-deporting back to Mexico. To say nothing of the fact that under this operation, the Border Patrol came under increasing scrutiny for charging immigrants $10 for the joy of being deported. That is equivalent to about $121 in today's money. The Border Patrol was also routinely inflating estimates of how many people were actually being deported. By the end of the operation, the Border Patrol had claimed to have deported or self-deported 1.2 million Mexicans. But modern historians estimate that that number is probably closer to 300 or 400,000. But from that point on, the U.S. Border Patrol begins focusing almost exclusively on deporting Mexican nationals. To put this in perspective, I'm looking at something called the Mapping Deportation Projects. This is a project from a team of researchers at UCLA that maps deportations going all the way back to 1895. Well, according to them, in 1830, Mexicans were about 51% of all deportations. But by 1954, they were 84%. This brings us to the 1990s when Congress passes the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Not only does this law create the legal framework under which the federal government can start to streamline the deportation process, it actually made it much harder for immigrants to claim asylum in the United States. Just as a refresher, the idea of political asylum is that refugees can claim protection from persecution in their home countries inside a new country once they get there. And it goes back all the way to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But the IIRIRA, what an acronym, puts a bunch of limits on asylum. That includes a 1-year time limit to claim asylum, additional screening, expedited removal processes, and mandatory detention of certain immigrants, including asylum seekers who were placed in expedited removal proceedings. Under that legal framework, plus the changes that happened under George W. Bush, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and everything else that happened after 9/11, we start to see a vast increase in the number of deportations generally. That includes under the presidency of Barack Obama. You may remember him being called the deporter-in-chief by pro-immigration groups, but deportations under President Obama would hit 2.5 million total between 2009 and 2015, which was, at the time, well more than any other president in history. So that all brings us loosely to the modern era. Let's dig into recent events. I'm just going to assume everyone just kind of remembers the bad hombres era of 2016 to 2020. But moving on to 2024, it was no secret that Donald Trump wanted to ramp up deportations. In 2023, Trump said that illegal immigrants were quote-unquote poisoning the blood of our country. As part of Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation document that has since become the blueprint for Trump 2.0, the goal from the outset was to vastly expand ICE enforcement. It also involved ending a bunch of immigration programs like Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, and sharply reducing the number of foreign student visas that the U.S. hands out. It also, probably most crucially, involved vastly increasing the number of overall deportations. As you may have noticed, the Trump administration has done that, and more. In videos that have gone viral on social media, ICE has raided neighborhoods. Agents have pulled families from cars at gunpoint, and they've run checkpoints in some of our largest cities. Almost always wearing masks, ICE agents can make these stops without a criminal warrant, using something called administrative warrants instead, which don't need to be signed by a judge. And now, in order to meet strict deportation quotas, ICE agents are increasingly raiding large workplaces in dragnet-style raids, where they might detain dozens or hundreds of people and then decide after the fact if each person is living in the US legally. Under this system, it's clear that ICE is currently arresting many people who have not committed a crime, and in some cases, who are in the US legally or are US citizens. An analysis by the libertarian Cato Institute found that 1 in 5 people arrested under Trump's ICE crackdown have been Latinos with no criminal history and no standing removal orders. You may have seen news earlier this month of a massive ICE raid on a Hyundai battery factory in Georgia. That raid produced more than 500 arrests, of which about 300 were South Korean nationals. The problem is we know some number of those workers were in the US on valid short-term worker visas. An analysis by the New York Times found records for 11 workers who had either short 6-month or 90-day visas to work in the US. But of those 11, ICE said 10 were in the US unlawfully, though they didn't say how they knew that. ICE did admit 1 was in the US lawfully, but even then, an ICE field officer put that 1 worker on the list for voluntary departure. Now, South Korea's government is saying that it will investigate whether any of the workers arrested in the raid experienced human rights abuses during the process. And don't think that Nevada is going to be free from any White House scrutiny on immigration. On August 5th, the Department of Justice released a list of so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. They did not name what a sanctuary jurisdiction actually was, and wouldn't you believe Nevada was on the list? This despite the fact that Nevada has literally never been a sanctuary state. Of course, this all concludes with the largest ever budget increase for ICE, something like $170 billion included in the new Republican funding bill passed this summer. All this to say, it probably doesn't take much speculation to say we are much closer to the beginning of this phase of American history than the end. But that does it for today's episode. If you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe so you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. Until then, for Battleborn Progress, this has been Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. See you next week.